Elias Carter stood at the edge of the open hatch, feeling the artificial warmth of the Galactic Academy's transport ship seep away as the cold of Zyros 7 clawed at him. The icy wasteland stretched endlessly beneath the starless sky, the ground a treacherous expanse of jagged ice and frozen ridges. The air shimmered in the bitter cold, the temperature plummeting so low that any exposed skin would freeze within seconds. He clenched his fists, exhaling slowly as his breath formed a thick white cloud in front of him. The instructors had given him nothing except the standard-issue academy uniform, thin fabric that provided barely any insulation. Every other cadet had advanced thermal suits, bioadaptive armor, or environmental shields. Yet the Academy had refused to grant him the same. Humans, they claimed, were too weak to withstand the planet's brutal conditions. A voice crackled through the comms. "Carter, you have exactly 24 hours to survive. Good luck." The hatch slammed shut behind him, and the transport ship's engines roared to life. He barely had time to take a step before the propulsion system sent a gust of superheated air washing over the ice, melting the top layer into a slick glass. As the ship ascended, the deafening roar faded into the emptiness of the frozen wasteland, leaving only the howling wind and the distant cracking of shifting ice. He was alone. The cold hit him immediately. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a sensation that went beyond pain, beyond discomfort. It was a force that threatened to crush him from all sides. His fingers stiffened instantly, and the air that filled his lungs burned like fire. He had to move. If he stood still for even a few minutes, he would die before the test had truly begun. He scanned the area, his sharp eyes searching for any form of shelter. The landscape was a frozen graveyard, a vast, undisturbed expanse of ice formations jutting from the ground like the bones of some long-dead beast. The sky was a swirling gray, thick with ice particles that made visibility difficult. There was no sun, no discernible source of light, yet the ice itself seemed to glow faintly, casting an eerie, bluish-white illumination across the desolate terrain. He started walking, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. Every movement sent sharp jolts of pain through his limbs, his muscles tightening in protest. His breath came in ragged bursts, his body already struggling to maintain its internal temperature. He knew that his only chance of survival lay in finding shelter before the cold drained his strength completely. After what felt like an eternity, he spotted a cluster of jagged ice formations rising in the distance. It was his best hope. He forced his legs to move faster, ignoring the stabbing pain in his chest as the freezing air stripped away what little warmth remained in his body. The moment he reached the formations, he ran his hands over the surface, searching for any kind of opening. His fingers were numb, barely able to register sensation. But he didn't stop. Eventually, he found a narrow crevice, just wide enough for him to squeeze through. He ducked inside, pressing his back against the icy walls. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The wind still howled outside, but at least he was shielded from the direct blast of cold air. He needed to act fast. His body was shutting down, the early signs of hypothermia setting in. His skin was losing feeling, his heartbeat slowing. If he didn't find a way to generate warmth, he wouldn't last the night. He curled into himself, pulling his arms tightly against his torso. The Academy had taught survival techniques, but none of them had accounted for conditions this extreme. Fire was impossible. There was nothing to burn, no fuel, no oxygen-rich environment to sustain a flame. He had only one option: his own body heat. Focusing on his breathing, he forced himself to take slow, deep breaths, using a technique he had learned back on Earth. His ancestors had survived brutal winters, enduring conditions far beyond what most species could tolerate. They had developed methods to retain heat, to manipulate their own bodies to endure the impossible. He could do the same. He drew his knees close to his chest, minimizing his exposed surface area. Every second counted. His thoughts became sluggish, his vision blurring at the edges. The cold was relentless, gnawing at him like a starving predator. He refused to let it win. He clenched his jaw, forcing his mind to stay sharp. He had survived worse. He had fought against exhaustion, against pain, against odds that others deemed impossible. This was no different. It was just another fight, another challenge to overcome. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Then 2. His body remained tense, locked in battle with the cold. His heartbeat steadied, his breathing slowed to a controlled rhythm. He wasn't comfortable, far from it, but he was alive. And that was enough. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind screaming like a living thing. The temperature continued to drop, the ice cracking as the pressure shifted. He could feel it in his bones, the weight of the planet pressing down on him, testing him, waiting for him to fail. But he wouldn't. He had 24 hours, and he would survive every last one of them. The icy wind screamed through the crevice, a relentless force that never ceased. Elias remained curled in the tight space, his arms wrapped around his knees, his body pressed against the frozen walls. The temperature had plummeted further, the air so cold that each breath burned his lungs like inhaling shattered glass. His body ached from the stiffness, but he refused to move. Every unnecessary motion wasted precious energy, and he had no heat to spare. The hours stretched endlessly. His mind hovered on the edge of consciousness, drifting between awareness and the dangerous pull of exhaustion. Sleep was a death sentence in this cold. His core temperature was already dropping, and if he allowed himself to slip under, his body might never wake again. He gritted his teeth, focusing on the rhythmic expansion of his chest as he forced slow, measured breaths. The crevice provided some protection from the worst of the wind, but it wasn't enough. His fingers had lost sensation long ago, and the creeping numbness spread through his limbs like a slow-moving poison. He flexed his hands inside his sleeves, trying to force some circulation back, but his fingers responded sluggishly. If he didn't get his blood flowing soon, frostbite would set in. He needed to move. Carefully, he uncurled himself, forcing his stiff muscles to stretch. Pain shot through his joints, sharp and unforgiving, but he welcomed it. Pain meant he was still alive. He pressed his palms against the frozen ground, pushing himself up slightly. His body felt heavier than before, as if the cold had sunk into his bones and settled there like a lead weight. He ignored the sensation. His survival depended on action, not complaints. He scanned the entrance of the crevice. The wind had packed fine layers of ice against the opening, creating a thin barrier that filtered the outside light. It wouldn't be enough to keep him insulated. If he stayed here, the cold would seep through every crack, draining what little warmth remained in his body. He had to do better. Shuffling forward, he reached out and brushed his gloved hand against the wall of ice. The texture was smooth and brittle. His breath was shallow, his movements sluggish, but his mind was still working. If he could reinforce the entrance, seal himself in, he could trap what little body heat he generated. He had no tools, nothing but his hands and the environment around him, but he had knowledge. He knew how ancient humans had survived ice ages, how they had built shelter using nothing but the frozen earth and their own instincts. He could do the same. Ignoring the stiffness in his limbs, he scraped at the ice, collecting small, jagged chunks and pressing them into the gaps of the entrance. The pieces stuck together, bonding in the sub-zero air. He gathered more, packing them tightly, layering them like bricks. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, misting the air as he worked. The wind howled outside, but the sound grew fainter as the barrier thickened. Minutes passed. Then an hour. His fingers barely functioned, his knuckles raw from the cold, but he kept going. When the last gap was sealed, he sat back, panting. The difference was immediate. The crevice was still bitterly cold, but without the direct wind cutting through, his body felt slightly less exposed. He wasn't safe, not yet. His body heat alone wouldn't be enough to sustain him. He needed more insulation. He shifted his focus inward, tightening his clothing as much as possible. He tucked his arms deeper into his sleeves, pressed his legs together, and buried his hands against his core. Every bit of warmth had to be preserved. His heart was slowing. He could feel it. The gradual decrease in beats per minute, the sluggishness creeping through his veins. He had to fight it. He clenched his jaw, forced his body to shiver, a last-ditch survival mechanism humans had evolved to generate heat. The violent tremors racked his frame, his teeth clattering together, but the movement forced his muscles to work, to burn what little energy remained. Time crawled. His mind wavered between exhaustion and raw instinct. He lost track of the hours, the darkness pressing in from all sides. His body ached with a deep, consuming fatigue, but he refused to close his eyes. He counted his breaths, focused on each inhale and exhale, forcing his mind to stay alert. Somewhere in the depths of the storm, a distant cracking sound echoed. His instincts sharpened instantly. He wasn't alone. Something was moving out there. The distant cracking sound sent a sharp jolt through Elias's exhausted mind. His body tensed instinctively, his breath slowing as he listened. The wind still howled outside, but beneath it there was something else. A deep, resonant shift in the ice, like the groan of something massive under strain. His pulse quickened. Ice didn't just crack on its own without reason. Either something was moving out there, or the planet itself was shifting under the weight of the storm. Neither possibility boded well for his survival. Forcing his stiff body to move, he leaned forward slightly, peering through the faint gaps in his makeshift ice barrier. The outside world was nothing but a swirling haze of white, the wind carrying ice particles so fine they seemed like mist. His visibility was nearly non-existent. He exhaled slowly, his breath fogging the tiny space in front of him, and pressed his ear to the ice wall. The sound came again, closer this time, a low, almost rhythmic crunching, like footsteps on the frozen terrain. Something was approaching. His fingers twitched toward his belt, though he had no weapon. The academy hadn't allowed him any tools, no knife, no emergency beacon, nothing but his training and his instincts. He clenched his jaw. If something was out there, he had to be ready for it. A dark shape flickered in the storm, just beyond the barrier. His breath caught. It was massive, a towering form that moved with slow, deliberate steps. The swirling ice made it impossible to make out details, but its silhouette was unmistakably alien. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he pressed himself further back into the crevice. The creature stopped a few meters away. The wind shifted for a brief moment, revealing a glimpse of its form. A thick, quadrupedal body covered in what looked like armored plating, its long, clawed limbs adapted for traversing the treacherous terrain. Its head was low to the ground, massive tusks protruding from its jaw, its breath forming dense clouds of mist in the freezing air. Elias remained perfectly still. The beast sniffed the air, its large nostrils flaring as if searching for something. He had no idea if it could detect him through the ice, but if it did, he had nowhere to run. His mind raced, analyzing the situation. The creature wasn't moving aggressively, but its size alone made it a threat. He had no way of fighting it, no means of defending himself against something that big. His only hope was that it would lose interest and move on. Seconds dragged into minutes. The beast continued to sniff the air, its heavy footfalls crunching against the ice as it shifted its weight. Then, slowly, it turned. Elias exhaled quietly, relief flooding his chest as the creature lumbered away, disappearing into the storm. He stayed motionless for a long time after it left, his body still wound tight with adrenaline. His thoughts raced. If that thing was native to Zyro 7, then the planet wasn't just a frozen wasteland. It was a hunting ground. He had been so focused on surviving the cold that he hadn't even considered what else might be out there with him. Shivering, he turned his attention back to his immediate reality. His shelter had kept him alive through the worst of the night, but he was running out of time. He needed more than just a hole in the ice to survive. He needed heat. He needed fuel, and most importantly, He needed a plan. His fingers ached as he worked to loosen the ice sealing the entrance. He had to be careful not to collapse the entire structure, but he needed a way out. The storm had lessened slightly, though the wind still carried enough force to bite through his thin uniform. He pulled his sleeves tighter around his hands and stepped outside. The world around him was eerily silent. The ice reflected a pale, ghostly glow, the vast landscape stretching into the endless horizon. His breath came in short bursts as he scanned the terrain. His body screamed for warmth, for shelter, stronger than the crevice he had spent the night in. Then something caught his eye. Not far from where the beast had stood, there were strange markings in the ice. At first he thought they were claw marks left by the creature, but as he moved closer he realized they were different, too precise, too structured. He crouched down, running his fingers over the grooves. They looked almost like footprints, but not from an animal. These were made by something bipedal. His stomach twisted. He wasn't alone. Lifting his gaze, he scanned the horizon again, his senses heightened. The thought of another living being out here was both a relief and a threat. If there were intelligent life on Zyro 7, that meant there might be technology, shelter, fire, a way off this frozen death trap. But it also meant there were things watching him. He clenched his fists, forcing his mind to focus. He had to move. He had to find out who or what was out there before they found him first. Elias crouched over the strange footprints, his breath forming misty clouds in the frigid air. His body was stiff from the night's ordeal, but adrenaline had burned away most of the numbness. The prints embedded in the ice were deep, as if the creature, or person, who left them carried significant weight. They were humanoid, though much larger than his own. Each step pressed into the ice with unnatural force, the indentations nearly twice the depth of his own boot prints. Whoever had been here had either incredible mass or was wearing something that made their steps heavier. He straightened slowly, scanning the barren expanse ahead. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silent, frozen wasteland bathed in a dim bluish glow. Ice stretched in every direction, unbroken except for the jagged formations that jutted from the ground like crystalline spires. The air was thin, every breath sharp against his throat, but it was no longer chokingly dense with ice particles. Visibility had improved, though not by much. He followed the footprints, keeping his steps light to avoid making unnecessary noise. His mind worked through the possibilities. If there was intelligent life on Zyro 7, why had he not been warned? The Galactic Academy had deemed this place inhospitable, yet something, or someone, was living here. And if that were true, then the planet wasn't as empty as they had believed. The prince led him toward a series of ice ridges, their jagged surfaces shaped by relentless winds. As he approached, something caught his eye, a faint, rhythmic flicker of light, almost imperceptible against the ice's natural glow. He narrowed his eyes, focusing. The flicker was not natural. It was artificial. He moved carefully, keeping close to the ridges for cover. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, his muscles coiled in preparation for anything. As he crested a small rise, the source of the flickering light came into view, a structure. At first he thought it was just another ice formation, but as he focused, the distinct outlines of a built environment emerged. A large, reinforced dome sat nestled between the ridges, partially camouflaged by layers of frost and snow. The structure was alien in design, smooth and rounded, unlike any human-made outpost he had ever seen. Translucent panels lined the exterior, glowing faintly from within, casting a dim light onto the surrounding ice. His breath caught in his throat. If there was a structure, then there were inhabitants. If there were inhabitants, then there was warmth. His body screamed for heat, for shelter, for something, anything, that could push back the relentless cold gnawing at his core. But his instincts warned him to stay cautious. He had no idea who or what was inside. He circled the perimeter slowly, keeping his body low. The dome's exterior was sleek, with no visible seams or entry points. Whoever built it had designed it to withstand the planet's brutal conditions. His fingers ran over the surface, feeling a faint vibration beneath the material. It was active, operational. A soft, mechanical hum reached his ears, almost lost in the wind. Then a sound. Subtle but distinct. Movement. He froze. Something shifted inside the structure. He strained to listen, his pulse hammering. The movement wasn't random, it was deliberate. Someone, or something, was in there. His options were limited. He could remain outside, risk freezing, and possibly miss his only chance at survival, or he could find a way inside and face whatever waited for him. The decision was made for him. The ground beneath him trembled, a deep, resonant vibration that sent a sharp crack rippling through the ice. His breath hitched. A fissure split just inches from his feet, spiderwebbing outward. He had seconds to react. He lunged forward, slamming his hands against the dome's surface, searching for anything, a latch, a seam, an opening. The ice groaned beneath him, the crack widening. Then, as if sensing his desperation, a section of the dome shifted. A thin, vertical line of light appeared, widening into an opening just large enough for him to squeeze through. He didn't hesitate. He threw himself inside just as the ground beneath him gave way. The moment he crossed the threshold, the temperature shifted. A wave of warmth hit him like a physical force, his frozen body drinking it in greedily. His muscles, stiff from hours in the cold, reacted violently, a painful sensation flooding his limbs as warmth returned too quickly. His vision blurred, the contrast overwhelming his senses. He collapsed onto the smooth, metallic floor, his breath ragged. Dim golden light illuminated the interior. The walls were curved, lined with intricate patterns that pulsed faintly. The air was thick, slightly humid, filled with an unfamiliar scent, something earthy, almost metallic. A low, mechanical chime echoed through the space. Then footsteps. His body tensed, his instincts screaming at him to move, but his muscles refused to cooperate. The exhaustion, the cold, the sudden warmth. It was too much. He could only watch as a shadow loomed over him. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was a pair of luminous, inhuman eyes staring down at him. Elias's consciousness drifted in and out of darkness, his mind trapped between exhaustion and awareness. His body no longer felt the unbearable cold that had tormented him for hours. Instead, a deep, penetrating warmth surrounded him, unfamiliar but comforting. His limbs felt heavier than before, as if his body was reluctant to respond, weighed down by something thicker than fatigue. A faint hum pulsed in the air, rhythmic and steady, like the gentle vibration of a machine in the distance. Slowly, his senses returned. His skin tingled, a strange prickling sensation spreading through his muscles as circulation resumed. The air was warm, filled with an odd mixture of metallic sterility and something faintly organic, like damp earth. He took a slow, measured breath, his lungs adjusting to the change. The sharp bite of freezing air was gone, replaced by something richer, denser. He opened his eyes. A dim golden glow illuminated the space around him, emanating from smooth, curved walls lined with intricate, pulsating patterns. The ceiling arched above, almost organic in shape, its surface shimmering as if alive. The air felt thick but not oppressive. It was engineered, controlled, an artificial environment perfectly maintained. His body was resting on a slightly elevated platform, smooth and slightly concave, designed to accommodate his shape. A faint warmth radiated from beneath him, almost as if the surface was reading his body's needs and adjusting its temperature accordingly. He sat up slowly, his muscles protesting. His uniform was still damp from the ice outside, but he no longer felt the suffocating cold pressing into his bones. Instead, he felt something else. Eyes watching him. He turned his head sharply. Across the room, partially obscured by shifting light patterns, stood a figure. Tall, imposing yet eerily still. The being's silhouette was humanoid, but its proportions were slightly off. Elongated limbs, a broad but lean torso, and a posture too rigid to be entirely natural. Then, the figure stepped forward. The movement was deliberate, controlled, exuding an unmistakable intelligence. As it moved into the light, Elias finally saw it clearly. The being's skin was a deep iridescent blue, its texture smooth but slightly ridged along the arms and shoulders. Its eyes, large, luminous, and shifting in color between silver and deep violet, studied him with an unreadable expression. It was alien. Not a primitive beast, not a mindless entity wandering the ice world, but an intelligent, sentient being. And it had saved him. Elias remained motionless, his instincts warning him to gauge the situation before making any rash decisions. He was unarmed in an unknown environment, entirely at the mercy of this being. If it had wanted to harm him, it had already had the chance. The alien tilted its head slightly, as if analyzing him. Then, in a movement so fluid it was almost unnatural, it raised one hand and pressed its palm against the glowing wall. A thin, translucent screen flickered into existence, symbols and data scrolling across its surface in a language Elias couldn't read. The alien's fingers moved over the interface with precise, calculated movements, adjusting something Elias couldn't comprehend. Then, a sound. A low, reverberating chime filled the room. The alien turned its gaze back to him and spoke. The voice was deep and layered, carrying a resonance that seemed to vibrate in the air rather than travel through it. The words were unfamiliar, an intricate language filled with tonal shifts and subtle inflections. Elias didn't understand a single word. He exhaled slowly, then shook his head. "I don't understand." His voice came out hoarse, rough from the cold and dehydration. The alien watched him for a moment, then adjusted something on the interface. The chime echoed again. Then it spoke once more, this time in a language he recognized. "You should be dead." The voice was still layered, still alien, but the words were unmistakably clear. Elias stared at the being. His mind worked rapidly, absorbing the gravity of the situation. This creature had technology far beyond what the Galactic Academy had prepared him for. It had studied him, observed him. Perhaps it had even been watching since he was first dropped onto Ziro 7. His instincts told him to respond carefully. He straightened his posture, suppressing the lingering stiffness in his limbs. "I've been told that before." The alien's expression remained unreadable, but something in the way its eyes shifted suggested curiosity. "Humans should not survive in these conditions," it said, each word slow, deliberate. "Yet you did." Elias's pulse quickened. The way it spoke suggested familiarity with his species, not just a passing knowledge. He was no longer just dealing with an unknown alien presence. He was dealing with something that already knew what humans were. "I adapted," he said simply. The alien studied him for a long moment, then gestured toward the interface. More symbols scrolled across the screen, but then, to Elias's astonishment, the display shifted. Diagrams appeared, anatomical charts, side-by-side comparisons of different species. One of them was unmistakably human. Elias's stomach tightened. "How do you know about us?" he asked carefully. The alien didn't answer immediately. Instead, it turned back toward him, its luminous eyes locking onto his. "You are being tested," it said finally. "This world was meant to break you." Elias inhaled sharply. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The Galactic Academy hadn't just sent him here as part of a survival exam. This was more than just a test of endurance. This was an experiment. He clenched his fists, his mind racing. The Academy had deemed 07 inhospitable, a death trap meant to push cadets to their limits. But what if they had known? What if they had sent him here not to test his survival skills, but to see how he would be observed by something else? His thoughts were interrupted as the alien spoke again. "We have studied many species," it said. "None have survived unaided." Elias exhaled, his breath steady despite the storm brewing in his mind. "Then I guess we're different." The alien was silent for a moment, then took a slow step forward. "You are." Elias met its gaze, unflinching. He didn't know what would come next, what this being intended to do with him, but one truth had become undeniable. Humans, the so-called weakest species, had defied death itself, and now the universe was watching.